Hello, good evening. My name is Rob Roper. I am the president of the Ethan Allen Institute. Thank you very much for having me here this evening. The presentation that I'm going to perform for you tonight is called The Triumph of Liberty, the Moral and Practical Superiority of Free Market Capitalism. And the reason that I put on this program, I've been taking this around the state. I've been giving it in Grange halls like this, and Rotary clubs, and libraries, and college campuses, is because free market capitalism is, in my opinion, the greatest force for good the human race has ever come upon. And the evidence that I'm going to show you in tonight's presentation is going to back that up. Before we get into the subject, though, I just want to briefly mention what the Ethan Allen Institute is. The Ethan Allen Institute is Vermont's free market-oriented think tank. Well, what is a think tank? We do a lot of things. We have a lot of programs that we put out. We follow a lot of issues. Some of our big programs that we've done in this past year, we put together a documentary film called Turning Blue, which is all about Vermont and what's happening in Vermont, outside money coming into Vermont, influencing our policies, particularly in regard to single-payer health care, and Vermont being the spear tip on a national program for single-payer health care. So check that out at ethanallen.org. The other major project that we've done over this past year is we put together what we call roll call profiles on all 180 Vermont legislators. And those are profiles that take you through their names, important to know, the districts, the towns that they represent, and for the House, the top 12 votes, and how your representative voted on things like tax issues, on land use issues, anything that basically has to do with liberty is what we focus on. So 12 votes in the House, 12 votes in the Senate. So pick it up at a glance, you understand exactly how you are being represented in the State House by your representatives or senators. So as a think tank, I took this job in January of 2013. And December for that January, I was sitting around thinking to myself, okay, I've agreed that I'm going to take on this job. What is it that I'm really going to do to promote the principles of the Ethan Allen Institute? Liberty, free market capitalism, limited constitutional government. We've talked about taxes in the past. We've talked about the Taxpayer Bill of Rights. We've talked about health care. We've talked about education and school choice. The organization has a 20-year history. What do we really need to do to make people sit up, wake up, and understand all these great things that we should be doing as a state and in our communities? And as I'm doing this, a lady named Bethany Knight, up in the Northeast Kingdom, she's a writer, put together a series of articles on poverty in the Northeast Kingdom. And it was about 10 articles that were originally printed in the Caledonian Record. And in one of these articles, I came across this quote. Vermont's 2010 Person of the Year, this is a 30-year employee of the Vermont Department of Health and Human Services, uttered this quote for this article. And what he said was, people are kept in poverty because of the economic system we have. In order for capitalism to survive, you need poverty. And I got to tell you, I just about ripped my hair out when I read that quote. And I said, that's it, that's what we've got to do. We've got to make people understand exactly what the basis, the moral basis of free market capitalism really is. It is a force for good. It has nothing to do with poverty. But you hear this down in the State House all the time from your representatives. You hear this from our senior senator all the time. The reason that people are poor is because of unfettered free market capitalism. The reason why health insurance is so expensive is because unfettered free market capitalism, greedy people going after profits. The reason that the banking system collapsed is because of greedy capitalists who are out there messing everything up. That's not capitalism. Bernie Madoff is not capitalism. Bernie Madoff is fraud, which has no part of free market capitalism. So what is free market capitalism? And this is an important thing that we have to ask. Capitalism is money that can be used to produce further wealth. What does capitalism need? It doesn't need poverty. It needs capital. Now let's think about this for a second. All those greedy capitalists out there, if you are a store owner, how do you benefit at all from a customer who's too poor to buy your product? You don't. You don't benefit at all from a customer who's too poor to buy your product. So how does poverty benefit you if you're that capitalist who owns a store? Not at all. If you're the customer, how do you benefit from a store owner who is too poor to stock his or her shelves with goods or buy the latest, newest equipment to inventory their shelves so you can go buy them? You don't benefit at all. Capitalism does not need poverty. Poverty is anathema to capitalism. Capitalism grows people out of poverty. Because capital is about money that can be used to produce further wealth. Wealth is the antidote to poverty. Anybody, it drives me nuts. I hear all these people down at the State House say, I'm a very liberal, socialist-minded, progressive-minded person because I hate poverty. Well, if you hate poverty, then you need to create wealth. Because it's the only thing in the world throughout history that will ever get people out of poverty. Those are the policies that we should be pursuing, those that lift people out of poverty. So what is free market capitalism? This is the best definition I've ever come across, and I think it's a wonderful one. Very simple. A system in which people can engage in peaceful, voluntary exchange, free from force or fraud. And that's the important part there. That's why it's underlined on the card there. Free from force or fraud. This gets back to Bernie Madoff. There's, oh, capitalism's out of control. That's not capitalism, because he was engaged in fraud. If somebody comes in and steals from you, they're engaged in force. That's not capitalism. For somebody to engage in free market capitalism, I have to come to you and I have to say, I want to sell you my coffee cup. This coffee cup is for sale. I have to find out if you need the coffee cup, and then we have to come on to an agreement about how much you're going to pay me for the coffee cup. That's what free market capitalism is. If we can't come to an agreement on what that is, then we don't make the deal. Now, the reason that I picked the image of a handshake for this is very important. Because when it's free from force or fraud, you have to know the person that you're talking to. I can't come over here and I can't bop you over the head and take your money. I have to make a coffee cup or acquire a coffee cup and sell you to get the money that I need. So I need to know about what you need. Maybe you don't need a coffee cup. Maybe you drink soda out of a can. So maybe I have to come up with soda. Something like that. I have to figure out what you need. I have to know you as a person. I have to know your wants. I have to know your needs. I have to know your desires. I get to know you as a human being. Isn't that what all the politicians always say we need to be doing? Why can't we just get along? Why can't we just get to know one another? Why can't we support? Capitalism forces us to do that. It forces the handshake. There's no force or fraud. There's no hitting the person over the head. There's no cheating them in a capitalist system. And that's where the role of government comes in. Why did humans form governments at all in the first place? Why don't we just run in the wild? And it goes back to caveman times. And this situation here, you got the big guy who comes along and whacks the little guy over the head with his club, and he takes whatever it is that he wants. He drags his woman back to the cave, or the little guy, let's say the little guy has worked real hard to take down a mastodon and tracked it for weeks, killed it, spent all his effort dragging it back, cutting it up, and then the big guy comes along and whacks him over the head and takes it. Well, there's no justice in that. It's not fair. B, I think everybody's looking around and saying, we're never going to get anywhere unless we have some sort of security in knowing that if we put effort into a project, the biggest guy or the cleverest guy or the biggest group of people can just come in and steal from us what we've done, what we've earned, what we've provided, the wealth that we've created, the value we've created. We need to be able to keep the value we've created. Otherwise, there's no security, and we don't move forward as a people. Because if I have no incentive to go out and take down the mastodon, and you have no incentive to grow the crop, and you have no incentive to make the bows that I use to string the mastodon, because I'm just going to take from you, you're just going to take from me. It's chaos. So government, the role of government is very important. A lot of people say, oh, you libertarians, you free market people, you're all laissez-faire, you hate government. No, government has a very important role. And it's the one that we've determined is the preservation of property rights. That's the moral foundation of why government exists, essentially to protect private property rights of citizens. You ever hear the expression, possession is 9/10 of the law? There's a misunderstanding about what that means. And a very brilliant lawyer explained it to me once. He said, possession is 9/10 of the law. Everybody seems to think that if you're holding something, if I steal your wallet, but I've got it, then the law is going to be on my side 9/10 of the time. It's not what it means. What it means is 9/10 of the law is about property rights, preservation of property, owning something, possession. Possession is 9/10 of the law, because that is the moral foundation of what government does. It protects our property rights. It figures out how we have property rights in the government system. And this is a very important fact of what the moral foundation of government is. And we'll get to what happens when that breaks down in just a little while. I want to talk a great story about the first Thanksgiving. We just had Thanksgiving fairly recently here. And it goes back to the founding of, if not our nation, certainly our civilization on this continent. And it started out with a collective vision of how people ought to live together. When the Pilgrims came over and landed in Plymouth, it was as everybody owned everything in common. It was the Marxian ideal of everybody is supposed to contribute according to their ability and take from the common according to their need. Well, they almost starved as a result of this. So they spent a couple of winters trying to get along like this. They weren't producing any food. There was a lot of strife amongst the people. It wasn't working at all. And then I'll read this passage from book Mayflower by Nathaniel Philbrick, which is a fantastic book, and I recommend it to anybody who gets a chance to read it. Quotes, in the fall of 1623 marked the end of Plymouth's debilitating food shortages. For the last 2 seasons, the Pilgrims had grown crops communally. In April, Governor Bradford had decided that each household should be assigned its own plot to cultivate, with the understanding that each family kept what it grew. The inhabitants never again starved. See, what they did was before, and Philbrick describes it very well, is before Governor Bradford had decided that everyone was going to have private property ownership of what they produced. They were going to keep their own labor. Nobody was going to come in and take from them what they had produced. The dynamic was the husbands were going off into the field. They were trying to shirk as much of the work as they could. The wives and the kids stayed home, didn't contribute, and they were starving. So after he says, okay, you can keep whatever it is you grow, all of a sudden the kids were the ones sowing the saws, the wives and the husbands were out working in the fields together. They had plenty to work with, which not only fed themselves, it allowed them to have a robust trade with the local Indian tribes, local American Indian tribes. And that trade was based on free market capitalism. And it was a wonderful relationship that you had with the local Indian tribes, at least some of them, for about 62 years until you got to King Philip's War. That was when they decided to break down what was a free market capitalist society and go to a big guy with the club. What happens when government becomes the club? That's what they said. I don't want to anymore figure out what you need. I don't want to understand you as a person. I want to take from you by force or fraud, if you consider trading beads for good stuff, fraud. But it's an excellent story. And there's so many of them that can be told. If you look at communist Russia, if you look at communist China, when they took over, and when those regimes took over in their countries, there's similar stories to this. Everything was going, they couldn't grow any food until they privatized the farms, and they let people grow their own stuff, and that was how they kept from starving their own people. Capitalism is what works. Capitalism is what lifts people out of poverty. Capitalism is what lets us move on to the next things. So I've got to give this great example. That's an old example from old times, but this is my favorite. It's a little dark in the picture here, but that's Michael Douglas in the movie Wall Street. Remember the greedy capitalist? That big scene, greed is good. But I want to talk a little bit about his cell phone, which you can sort of make out there. For those of you who don't remember, that Motorola cell phone was the size of a large brick and weighed probably a little more than that brick. It was just a phone. It had a battery life that was very short. You couldn't play Angry Birds on it. You couldn't use it like I could. My phone today, to use a map, it didn't have any of that stuff. It was just a phone about as big as a brick. You had to charge it in a suitcase, I think, if you wanted to carry it around. And it cost $8,806 in today's money. Or maybe 2012 money, something like that. But that's a cell phone. And I don't feel that old. This movie came out when I was just about ready to graduate from college. So, in my adult life, we've gone from that cell phone for $8,806, where everybody who saw that movie was like, ooh, remember him? He was walking on the beach with the cell phone. If I could only be a billionaire, like Gordon Gekko, I could have a phone that wasn't attached to a wall in my house with a little curly thing. To today, where I paid 99 cents for this iPhone 4S. I didn't get the big model. They were giving away the older models for $2. And this phone, I can do that. I can do, it was the map that brought me here today. I've got all my music on it. I've got everything on this phone, and I paid 99 cents for it. That's what capitalism does. That's what free market capitalism does. Everybody has these things. They're giving them away. Do you know anybody that doesn't have a cell phone today? So what it took a billionaire to be able to own and afford just 25 years ago is now commonplace. That is lifting the boat of everybody. It's material well-being for everybody. The standard of living for everybody in a capitalist society based on trade is, we all benefit from this. And you think about it, that relationship that I said in free market capitalism, I have to understand what you need if I want to sell you something. You may not even know you need it. You may not even know that, oh, playing a game on your phone is something that you desire until Steve Jobs said, look, you can play a game on this phone. They said, oh, I gotta have that. But it was from understanding who you were, even better than you understood who you were on a lot of these things. That it can be a map. It can, why do I have to have a Walkman and a phone? Why can't the Walkman and the phone be put together? Those are the kinds of ideas that are out there. And because we reward those ideas, Steve Jobs, before he passed away, was a very wealthy man. Bill Gates, a very wealthy man. A lot of people who come up with ideas like this cell phone are very wealthy people. But they have enriched the lives of all of us to get that way. Because that's one aspect of capitalism that I want to explain, and I think people really need to understand. Profit, as I've said, but a lot of people say is a dirty word. They come out and say, oh, it's terrible. Everybody wants profit. But the profit's the reason we got to get profit out of our medical industry. We got to profit out of this. We got to get profit out of that. Profit is a signal in a capitalist society that you have created value for somebody else. Isn't that a nice thing? In order for me to get something from you, I have to create value for you in a capitalist society. I can't just take it. If I just come and take something from you, that's not creating value for you. That's taking value from you. It's creating value for me, maybe, because I get something I didn't need. But in a capitalist society where you're trading with somebody free from force or fraud, I get something of value out of the trade, and you get something of value out of the trade. And it's a better deal for you, better deal for me. We both agree that it's a better deal. And that delta is wealth creation. That little bit of profit, it's not a bad thing. It's a symbol that we have created value for one another. And in a complex money system, it's not as easy as that all the time. But that's what it comes down to at its basis. In a capitalist society, we all are forced, because we can't steal from anyone or cheat anyone, to create value for one another. And that's why capitalist societies rise like they do. This is an amazing chart. This is an amazing chart. This is put together by an economist named Angus Madison. And basically, he studies economy throughout world history. And this chart is from the year 0 all the way through, I guess it goes up to like 1998, but let's just call it present day. And all this time, you see the gross domestic product for the individuals of Western countries, Europe, the United States, Asia, Japan, Asia and Africa. And they're all pretty flat. Everybody's a subsistence farmer. There's feudalism. There's all sorts, you have the rule of kings, you have the rule of emperors. And right about here, in 1700, 1750, you see these Western countries start to just take off like a rocket. And what's happening in there? It's the Industrial Revolution. It's Adam Smith. It's the Bill of Rights, the United States Constitution. It's when governments all of a sudden started to realize that we have to protect property rights. We have to invest in the free market capitalism and trade. It's understanding one another. Did bad things happen in all these times? Sure, they did. But it was the countries that went with free market capitalism were the ones that really took off and the ones that really thrived. The ones that didn't stayed down here, and they're just barely pulling out of things, pulling out of their economic doldrums today. And how are they doing it? They're doing it by engaging in free market capitalism. It's an incredible chart. And just to humanize that chart a little bit, I don't know if you all know the rock star Bono from the band U2. He has been, of course, into African aid for years and years and years and years. He finally understood. And he came out with this quote just in the past 6 months or so. He came to the realization that for everything he's been doing for decades in Africa, commerce is real, foreign aid is just a stopgap. Commerce and entrepreneurial capitalism take more people out of poverty than foreign aid. Of course we know that. We need Africa to become an economic powerhouse. He gets it. Finally. And it gives me hope, too, that we can get out there and show people the same things that Bono was seeing, and know that if we want to lift anybody out of poverty, it doesn't have to be in Africa, it could be in the Northeast Kingdom, it could be in Burlington, it could be right here in our own neighborhood. Free market capitalism is the answer to what we want to do. Now, I just want to compare free market capitalism to some of the other, what I call false moralities of government. Preservation of property rights is the moral foundation of what government should do. It is just to reiterate a little bit before we get into here, what do we give government a monopoly of in order to enforce the laws? Well, what we want to do, I'm going to go to the next slide here, back to my caveman slide, is we want government to come right in there as a wall between the guy with the club and the guy who's getting hit. So we give government a monopoly on violence. Nobody else is allowed to use violence but government. Government has a special place, and it's a dangerous place. And George Washington said it very well. Government is force. Government is force. It is a dangerous master, like fire. I'm butchering his quote, but that's essentially what he said. Because we don't want violence in our lives. Government, it's reactive. It should not. It only uses violence to prevent other violence or to stop somebody else from committing violence against you. That's why we give it a monopoly. It's a very treasured, dangerous thing that we give government. But what's dangerous when government becomes the club? What happens when government becomes this guy? What's the difference between me saying, I want your money, I hit you over the head and I take what I want from you, or saying, I want your money, Representative so-and-so, I would like you to pass a bill taking Ron's money and giving it to me. Is there a moral difference? I don't think there is. And we get to the same point that I described before. When this caveman can come in and knock you over the head and take the mastodon that you've spent all summer tracking and bringing down and butchering, there's no incentive to do it if you know somebody can just come along and take it away. And it doesn't matter if that somebody is me with a club or if it's somebody else using the power of politics. Government is supposed to stop this. The morality of government is supposed to stop these kinds of things from happening, not perpetuate them. It's breakdown. It's a breakdown when government becomes the club. We no longer live in a moral society. We come in it degenerates into a screw thy neighbor society that we live in. How can I use my government to take money from you so I don't have to buy food? or I don't have to do this, or I don't have to do this. There are genuinely needy people out there, and charity is a very big part of capitalism. But it's a much more moral way of lifting people up out of poverty. We talked about that a little bit more towards the end. So this is what happens when government becomes a club. And before I go to the next page, I just want to remind you of that Thanksgiving scene that I showed before. And that's 60 years. If you read Philbrick and that book and a lot of other books about the early colonization, when they're trading with the American Indians, they're noble people. They're the language that they use to describe them. They're noble, they're honest, they are handsome, they are wise, all sorts of positive things in a capitalist relationship. But once you get to the point where government becomes the club, they're savages, they're heathens, they're barbarians. And why is that? Because we're in a capitalist, free trade relationship. I have to know who you are. I care about you if we're going to do business together. But if I'm going to steal from you, it's probably better for me psychologically to dehumanize you. Otherwise, what does that make me? So state force as a means of redistribution leads to dehumanization as justification for confiscation. That's what happens when the role of the government becomes not protecting property rights, but redistributing property. The American Indians, African Americans, they're subhuman, they're uncivilized, they're inferior because we want to take from them their wealth of labor and use it for ourselves. State force as a means of redistribution leads to dehumanization as justification for confiscation. But some people will look at me and say, Rob, you're crazy. That is 200 years ago. That is 300 years ago. We live in a much more civilized society today. We would never be so prejudiced. The greedy, the corrupt, the 1%. State force as a means of redistribution leads to dehumanization as justification for confiscation. Take their money because they're bad. And I'm good. And I can feel good about myself and sleep with myself at night because I've dehumanized a segment of society. Is that the kind of society we want to live in? Where we're dehumanizing our neighbors so we can feel good about redistributing their wealth to us? It's not the kind of society I want to live in. A quick word about equality. Equality is being bandied about quite a bit. The president just talked about growing income inequality is one of the greatest threats to our country today. That is the biggest false idol as a moral basis for government that I think there is. And here's why. Because the equality doesn't exist in nature. Every tree is a different size. Every human being is different from the next human being. Equality, absolute equality of outcome, is something that can only be created by force. So, for every equality, for the creation of equality requires an equalizing force, and that equalizing force is by definition supremely superior to the thing that it is equalizing. And it thus creates the most unequal relationship imaginable, that between a master and a slave. Anybody who says, we want to make everything equal, well, they're up here making you equal. They're not offering to be down here, equal with everybody else. And that's how you get people like Mao Zedong and Stalin and Hitler murdering millions and millions of people. That is the worst one of them all. And George Orwell said it best. This is a situation where you will always find that all animals are equal, but some animals are more equal than others. Now I want to get back to this idea of poverty that I started out with, and that quote. In order for capitalism to survive, you need poverty. Well, I hope I've shown you throughout the presentation so far that the exact opposite is true. That poverty plays no role in capitalism. Capitalism lifts people out. But who does need poverty? Who does need poverty in order to survive? The welfare state needs poverty in order to survive. They would not have jobs. They would not have careers if it were not for millions of poor people that they had to serve to. And this is from the Health and Human Services website. This is not the Cato Institute or Heritage going out there digging up something and bringing it out. This is on their website. At 83,745 employees at HHS, it's one of the biggest agencies within the U.S. government. We own 2,980 buildings and lease another 1,003 for a total square footage of 51,864,431. We operate 1,240 locations throughout the United States and 12 internationally. HHS has a fleet of 795 owned vehicles, 2,930 leased vehicles. Our operating budget for fiscal year 2010 was approximately $854 billion. That is the poverty industry. We've spent how many trillions of dollars in the war on poverty since Lyndon Johnson announced it in the late 1960s, and poverty is now a higher percentage of our population than it was back then. It's gone from 14% to 16%. That's because these people need poverty in order to thrive. How do they trap people in poverty? This chart was put together by the Pennsylvania Department of Public Welfare. And it's a very interesting chart, and it shows here what they call a welfare cliff. This is how what's supposed to be a safety net turns into a spider's web. And basically what they determined that is a single mother is better off earning a gross income of $29,000 with $57,327 in net income and benefits than to earn a gross income of $69,000 in the free market with net income and benefits of $57,045. So the difference between earning $29,000 and $69,000 is pretty significant for a lot of people. So what they do is they come to this cliff. They say, don't push me over. Don't push me over that cliff, because if I go over that cliff, I'm going to lose out on a lot of income. And I have a story. I was just in Lamoille. I live in Stowe, and I was in Lamoille County talking to a business owner. He employs a little over 100 people in good-paying blue-collar jobs. And he said that one of his employees came to him just the other day, this was probably a couple weeks ago now, and said, I want to quit. He said, why do you want to quit? You're one of my best workers. Why would you want to quit? You got a good career here. He said, well, my wife was talking to the welfare officer, and the welfare officer told her, explained to her that our family could be getting a lot more if I quit my job and we didn't have that income. We could get a whole lot more in benefits. That's the cliff. Because what does that person decide? I have another friend of mine who just opened a business, and his employers are coming and saying, don't give me any overtime. Because if I take the overtime, my income is going to go over the poverty threshold for Obamacare to get the subsidies for Green Mountain Care, the health care subsidies. These people are making decisions to stay poor for the rest of their lives. Think about this, because if it doesn't make sense to earn more than that $29,000 or whatever the cutoff happens to be, it never will. You're making a decision to stay here forever. And that is the creation of a permanent underclass. That is what this country is adamantly against. We're supposed to be the place where people come to from all over the world, because that doesn't exist, a permanent underclass. But we're getting there. It's getting harder and harder. I shouldn't say harder and harder. It's getting harder and harder to escape this kind of dynamic. And you're seeing fewer people go from the rags to riches story. That's the kind of thing that we have to fight against. Capitalism, free market capitalism, is the way to do it. And one last point, and I'm going to give credit where credit is due. Looking at that welfare cliff, our own Governor Peter Shumlin described the welfare state that we've created as a system that we have designed that is cruel and unusual. And he's absolutely right. I could not have said it better myself. Trapping somebody in poverty like that for a lifetime or generations is a cruel and unusual policy. We want to embrace policies that lift people out of poverty, not perpetuate it. My closing thought and conclusion, what I hope you take away from this presentation today, is that free market capitalism is the only antidote to poverty. The only thing. If you hate poverty, embrace capitalism. and embrace wealth creation, because that's what lifts all boats. Free market capitalism provides a truly sound and moral foundation for a prosperous society. I want to live in a society where I have to understand you, and you have to understand me, and we have to create value for one another if we're going to get along. And to paraphrase my good friend Winston Churchill, I hope everybody understands that free market capitalism is the worst form of government except for all the others. Nothing's perfect. But thank you very much for coming tonight. I really appreciate your being here. If you want to learn more about the Ethan Allen Institute, it's ethanallen.org online, and check us out. We'd love to have you become part of our community. Thank you.